What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to the second episode of the VO2 Max podcast for 2023. If it's your first time joining in and listening to this podcast show, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And as always, anyone who is new, I encourage you to go back and listen to any episodes that interest you within our library of episodes on this podcast show. In today's episode, though, I'm going to be talking about compression boots. I've looked into this research and written on the topic of compression boots for recovery in athletes quite a bit over the past few years, but it had been a little while since I've looked at the research literature that's come out on this topic. And with this being an area that's relatively new and an area in which there's research that's kind of constantly being published, I figured it was worthwhile going back, taking another look at some of the more recently published research literature on this topic, especially because these types of recovery devices, so there's a whole market for recovery nowadays amongst both amateur and professional athletes, but honestly, I see these types of things being utilized on a day-to-day basis more often in age group or amateur athletes than I do among the professional endurance athlete field. And there's been an entire market that's been created around recovery products, so be it various devices, supplements, other types of modalities that are aimed at promoting recovery, or basically faster recovery, quicker recovery in between exercise sessions or after exercise sessions. And I could do a whole separate podcast on the topic of recovery. And at the end of this episode, I'll discuss a little bit more about like general approaches to recovery. But for the purpose of this podcast episode, I will stick to, and I will do my best to stick to just compression boots and the evidence surrounding them as far as it goes for recovery in endurance athletes, or just athletes more broadly. So one of the reasons that I really like looking into this topic in particular, especially compression boots, is because they are so expensive and they tend to be one of the most popular pieces of technology that is shared on social media or that other athletes talk about when it comes to recovery. Up there with compression boots is things like massage guns, but I very often see compression boots being utilized by endurance athletes, especially in the triathlon space and the running space. And so I have an interest in this topic in particular because of how common these devices are, as well as how expensive they are. They're pretty expensive, especially compared to some other recovery-based or recovery-promoting technologies or tools or items. With most like common brands selling recovery boots for anywhere between $500 to upwards of $1,500, depending on the tier of the compression boot that you get, as well as attachments and other accessories that you can add on with your purchase of compression boots. So I like diving into the research on this topic because personally I would like to know if something actually does what it says it does before I spend that much money on it. So it's for that reason that I enjoy talking about this topic a little bit, or for those reasons that I enjoy talking about this topic, and why I like diving into this research literature. So the last time I looked at this research literature was about 3 years ago, and back then I had concluded that the research on this topic was just too mixed. There was too much research, or there were some studies that were indicating that it had the potential to impact recovery, and I'll get into some of the ways in which the compression boots are supposedly targeting recovery here in a minute. But back when I looked at this, there were some research studies suggesting that they helped in certain areas of recovery, and then there were just as many research studies showing that they had no effect on those same markers of recovery. And so the research on this topic had been pretty mixed. And so 3 years ago, I concluded that essentially these devices just didn't really have much of a benefit for recovery. Probably worthwhile to spend your time, money, and energy on other aspects of recovery. And this is outside of sleep and nutrition, which I'll talk about at the end of this podcast when it comes to recovery more globally. But yeah, there are other modalities, especially modalities that don't really require expensive equipment, that have been studied a little bit more frequently and have shown some potential positive benefits more often than studies that show that they have no benefits. And so I concluded that it's basically worthwhile to just spend more time, energy, money on those modalities or those tools as opposed to compression boots. But I am very open-minded when it comes to new pieces of technology that get integrated into the athletic realm, because there are some new technologies and certain devices and tools and modalities that initially might not show much promise in the research literature, but over time start to garner a little bit more overwhelming evidence that they actually have some type of benefit. So I dove back into this research recently, a few months ago. I wrote on this topic as well. I'll be sure to link the full write-up into the show notes of this podcast, so that way you can go in and get access to the full write-up that I did in my VO2 Max forum on this topic. But yeah, let's dive into some of the research that I found. So as I mentioned, there's been research in the past that has shown some benefit, and then there's been research that has shown no benefit. So typically when you're trying to see if an intervention does what it says it does, or if you're trying to identify the efficacy of an intervention, you typically want the evidence in favor of the intervention to be more overwhelming than the evidence against that intervention. Very rarely do we ever have an intervention, a product, or a modality that in every single study that's ever been done on it shows benefit, and then there's no studies against it. That kind of scenario very rarely happens. So typically when you're looking at these types of interventions in the research literature, there's always going to be some studies that show positive benefit, and then there's always going to be some studies that show potentially no benefit or a negative benefit. And so just relying solely on one or two research studies to draw a sound conclusion on a topic typically isn't the best approach. It's typically a better approach to try and look at the body of literature as a whole. And this is one of the reasons why I tend to rely very heavily on looking at things like systematic reviews or meta-analyses in the research literature, because these types of papers oftentimes summarize all of the research literature that's been published to date on a particular topic of interest. Now, there aren't too many systematic reviews and meta-analyses conducted to date on compression boots. There's just a lot of individual studies that have been published, so I've typically relied more heavily on these individual studies and kind of looked at each individual study in isolation, and then tried to put each study into context as to what the greater body of literature is suggesting overall. And so more often than not, the research tends to be pretty mixed. In other words, for every study that shows there's some type of positive benefit, there's another study that shows that there's usually no benefit. Some of the ways in which compression boots are theorized to improve recovery is by improving the time it takes to regain exercise capacity after a fatiguing exercise session, quicker recovery of various hormonal indicators that might be elevated after a stressful exercise session, reducing inflammation after an exercise session. So these are some of the things that have been looked at in the research literature. And so there are some published research studies that show that wearing a compression boot, or wearing compression boots after a single session or a single fatiguing exercise session, that some participants do experience quicker recovery of exercise capacity, accelerated recovery of various hormonal indicators of stress after exercise, as well as some reduced pro-inflammatory biomarkers after exercise. So there is some promise there, but then there are also just as many studies that have been published that show that wearing compression boots after a fatiguing exercise bout has no benefit, and we don't see those positive outcomes on various markers of recovery after exercise. But there has been some more recently published studies, and so I wanted to highlight a few of those in particular that have been published very recently in the past year or so. So, for example, in 2022, there was a paper that was published in which they had 30 healthy adult males performing a fatiguing exercise bout and then wearing 30 minutes of compression boots, 30 minutes of compression garments, so just like a compression sock, or receiving no treatment whatsoever. So that would be the no treatment group. And they were looking to see if the compression boots or the compression garments had any effect on muscle soreness, fatigue, blood markers of stress or fatigue, so things like inflammatory biomarkers, hormones, as well as plyometric jumping performance at 1 and 2 days post-exercise. So very often what you'll see after a single bout of fatiguing exercise is that initially exercise capacity is diminished. And that's because the exercise bout itself creates damage and creates a state in which the body is fatigued. And so typically and it's particularly after a fatiguing exercise bout. So if you're doing something like a very easy exercise session, you typically won't see any detriment or decrements in performance. So the key here is to make sure that you give people a fatiguing exercise bout. So usually it's some type of like extensive plyometric based workout or a really fatiguing cycling or running session. And then they'll usually have participants engage in the intervention, which in this case is wearing compression boots, as well as wearing another group wearing compression garments, and then see how quickly the participants can kind of return to quote-unquote baseline performance levels or baseline status as far as things like inflammatory markers go and hormones go. And in this particular study, participants that were wearing the compression boots and the compression garment experienced a lesser drop in plyometric jumping performance at 1 and 2 days post-exercise bout compared with a control group. So in this particular study, basically what that indicates is that wearing the compression garments and also in the other group, those that were wearing the compression boots, both of those groups essentially experienced a quicker recovery of elastic and neuromuscular qualities post-exercise. So the plyometric jump performance test is really good at assessing someone's neuromuscular power. And so if that is recovering faster than no intervention after a fatiguing exercise bout, then in this particular study's case, that indicates that those that were in the compression boot group as well as the compression garment group had a quicker recovery of those neuromuscular qualities post-exercise. So that's one study that shows some positive benefit. There weren't any other benefits that were identified on any of the other outcomes they were looking at, but as far as recovery of neuromuscular qualities post-exercise or recovery of one aspect of their exercise capacity, there was a benefit. Another study published in 2022 found some similar results. And in this particular study, they had study participants engage in, a fatiguing bout of exercise. And then they had them wear compression boots. So there was just two groups. There was a control group that had no treatment and then one group that wore compression boots for 3 days after a fatiguing bout of exercise. And they essentially found something similar, that study participants had a quicker recovery of exercise capacity when compared to the control group. But in this study, they used compression boots, but they used a very specific form of compression that's called external counter pulsation. I had to look this up because I had no idea what this was when I was reading the study. And it's a really, really, really specific type of intermittent compression that's delivered through the compression boots. And they don't even really wear boots per se. It's more like they have blood pressure cuffs placed on 3 different spots along the leg, and then they're inflated and deflated in sequence with the beat of someone's heart, the rhythm of someone's heartbeat. And so this typically isn't the type of intermittent pneumatic compression that's delivered via consumer-based compression boots. So you have to take that into context when you're thinking about this study in particular, but it was a study that was published in 2022, so I wanted to include it, even though the type of compression that was delivered is probably not the type of compression that you're going to see in most consumer-based compression boots. But again, another study that showed some aspect of compression following a fatiguing bout of exercise had a positive impact on the ability to recover exercise capacity, or one aspect of exercise capacity, a little bit quicker compared to no treatment at all. And these were 2 of the more recent studies that I found. There wasn't a whole lot more research that was too recent outside of these few studies that I found in 2022. Most of the other studies that I had looked at, I had already seen when I looked at this research literature a few years ago. And so, honestly, I came to a very similar conclusion after looking at some of the newer research that was published in this space. There is still just too little research that's done, and whatever little research that has been done is still somewhat conflicting. And another big limitation of some of this research that's been done to date is that Most of the studies that have been included have pretty small sample sizes as well, which typically when you're trying to determine whether an intervention is truly efficacious or not, larger sample size typically help in order to kind of drown out some of the extra noise or some of the outliers that you might see in certain studies. Whereas if you have really, really small sample sizes, and let's say you have a few participants that experience a really dramatic improvement in recovery, and then the majority experience no recovery, the overall results of that study might be swayed by just those couple outliers. So much larger sample size usually helps to kind of drown out some of that noise so that whatever outliers do exist, it might not sway, or it doesn't really have too dramatic of an effect on the overall outcomes of a study. So that's another limitation to keep in mind as well when I'm looking at this research literature. So just too small sample sizes, not enough research has been done, and of the research that has been done, there's just not an overwhelming body of evidence to suggest that compression boots really impact recovery compared to no treatment or compared to like a placebo type intervention. And speaking of placebo, that kind of brings me to a final point that I have on compression boots. So something that's come up a lot when you read through some of these research papers and you get down to the discussion section where the researchers start putting their results into the context of other research that's been done, is the placebo gets brought up quite a bit. And so there's been a very real documented effect of placebo on outcomes. So essentially what that means is folks who are receiving an intervention and don't know whether or not it is the actual intervention that's being studied or not. So typically like when you're doing something like a classic drug study, you might give half the participants the actual drug, and then the other half of the participants might get a placebo drug that looks exactly like the real thing, but it's filled with like sugar or just an artificial filler. And so they're not actually getting the drug. And there's been a documented effect of receiving something that participants think is going to help them, and then them actually experiencing real positive benefits. And so it's become kind of this larger issue in the research literature, in which researchers are now almost having to take into account when they're performing studies with a placebo intervention, the fact that some participants in the placebo group are likely to experience some measurable benefit from receiving the placebo itself. And it's been brought up quite a bit on this topic of compression boots, because when people, especially people who haven't looked at this research literature and are completely naive as to what the compression boots do and what the actual research says on them, they just know that they've bought an expensive device that is supposed to help them recover. And so the placebo effect starts to come into play because they might truly believe that they are going to recover better by wearing these compression boots. And that does have a potentially profound effect on someone's ability to experience a positive outcome as it relates to recovery. And so that can't be discounted when you're looking at some of this research literature, especially when you're listening to some anecdotal evidence from, say, other athletes or professional athletes that have utilized these types of devices. Some people might get them, think that it's going to help them, and then they've convinced themselves that the compression boots are actually helping the recovery. And maybe some of it is psychological, but maybe some of it is physiological. If they truly believe that the compression boots are helping them, then they might actually experience some type of small physiological benefit. So that is something to consider as well when you're looking at this actual research. And so even though my conclusion on the research literature is that they're probably not worth the investment in terms of the actual physiological benefit, like true, objective, measurable physiological benefit that you're getting from the boots itself and wearing them, they still might be potentially beneficial for some athletes depending on how you utilize them. So a few different thoughts I have on athletes using this particular device are, one, if you go into purchasing the device and then wearing them with the expectation that it's going to help your recovery, and you have the extra money to spend on them because they aren't cheap, then by all means, if it's not really like putting you in a hole financially for a while, you have the money to spend on it, you wear them, they feel nice to wear, you relax while you're wearing them, and then you also truly believe that it's helping your recovery, then there's really no downside to wearing them. There's only the potential upside, because in the research that has been done, one thing that has been shown to be pretty clear is there doesn't seem to be any type of detrimental effect on recovery, which is important because we don't know. These could have had a potential detrimental impact on athletes' ability to recover that we just didn't account for. But luckily in the research literature, that doesn't seem to be the case. There hasn't really been any published research literature that's shown that there's been any sort of negative effect whatsoever. So in other words, wearing these recovery boots after sessions isn't going to have a negative effect on your ability to recover and show up for the next exercise session. So if you have the money and you want to buy them and you enjoy wearing them and you believe they're going to help, then by all means, get them and wear them and continue to believe that they're going to help you because they might actually be helping you in some small way. The other thought I have on this, and I actually kind of became more aware of this thought or this idea when I was listening to a podcast on a topic related to recovery, and the subtopic of compression boots came up. And someone on that podcast, I believe they were a physical therapist actually, they had a really good viewpoint on them. And they were discussing various recovery-based technologies and modalities in the space of their physical therapy encounters with athletes. I think they were a physical therapist for a sports team, or various sports teams maybe at the collegiate level. And they were saying that while yes, there might not be evidence to support that some of the modalities that they utilize, like compression boots, have a objective and direct effect on recovery, in some cases with certain athletes, with athletes in some sports especially tending to be very like type A and on the move and always going and feeling like they have to do more. She said that sometimes she'll just use these recovery boots just so that she can get an athlete to like sit still, lay down, and even maybe take a nap for 30 to 60 minutes. And so if using this tool allows you as an athlete to essentially sit down and relax, it might not be the boots themselves that help you recover better, but it might just be because they are indirectly causing you to sit down and relax. That might be of benefit to you as an athlete. And I thought that was a really interesting viewpoint or take or perspective on this because I hadn't really thought about it that way. I kind of just thought, well, if the research doesn't suggest that they're useful, and even if there is some kind of placebo effect, then they're just useless, right? Like they're just a really expensive placebo. And maybe they are just an expensive placebo. But for some athletes, especially like really, really dedicated endurance athletes, triathletes in particular too, managing 3 sports, and also having to navigate life on top of training for 3 sports. If using these can just get you to sit down for an hour a day and relax and read a book, maybe even take a nap, then honestly the benefit of just them getting you to lay down and relax and take a nap could be worth the $700, $800, $900, $1,000 that you spend on investing in them, assuming you have that money to spend and it's not going to hurt you financially. So those are my 2 kind of takes on it. Is one, the placebo effect is a very powerful thing, and that could certainly play a factor in compression boots having some type of indirect effect on recovery in athletes. And then also they could be utilized as a device that just forces athletes to lay down and relax and stop moving around for 30 minutes or an hour once a day if that's how often you use them. And so, yeah, those are kind of the 2 more, I guess, less evidence-based approaches or thoughts that I have on compression boots. But as far as the actual evidence-based thoughts, there just really isn't enough research literature to suggest one way or the other that they do or that they don't have any effect. Because the research is so mixed, there's no one clear direction in terms of what the research is tending to suggest at the moment. The most common improvement that I tend to see in the research literature is that they have some type of effect on an athlete's ability to recover exercise capacity, typically like more neuromuscular qualities of exercise capacity after a fatiguing exercise bout. So for example, like especially with runners, so a runner who does a really, really stressful, like say interval or tempo session, that can be quite fatiguing on the legs, and it can have quite a noticeable detrimental effect on an athlete's ability to, say, do another really hard and high intensity session for a few days afterwards. And so there might be some potential benefit based on some of the research that's been done that compression boots can potentially help recover the athlete's ability, their neuromuscular properties of the muscle maybe a little bit quicker, and in between training sessions. So there is that potential benefit that they can help an athlete recover certain aspects of their exercise capacity. But again, there's just still not enough research that's been done, and the sample sizes are still so small that even though I tend to see that trend the most with the studies that have been published, it's really hard to say for sure that it's likely helping. But that potential does exist, probably more so than any other type of aspect on recovery that the compression boots are theorized to have. And there are other modalities out there that have shown some evidence to suggest that they can also help in recovering neuromuscular qualities of muscles post-exercise. So things like foam rolling, that's one that has a little bit more evidence to it to suggest that it can help with recovering certain qualities of exercise capacity after a fatiguing bout of exercise. But yeah, foam rolling just has a little bit more evidence to say with a little bit more certainty. Compression boots, not quite as much. But that is the trend that I see if I were to pick out one marker of recovery, that compression boots tends to have the most evidence to or supporting it. So hopefully this little update on the research literature as far as compression boots goes and athletic recovery is useful for you. I know it's always useful for me as a coach and an athlete as well, to get updated on these types of things, especially in some of these areas where the research is kind of emerging and growing over time. And so with this whole market now being developed around recovery, I like to really dive into the research on some of these different tools and modalities and pieces of technologies just to see if there is something that does stand out over time that does have some sort of measurable effect on recovery for athletes from a research-based objective standpoint. But what I wanted to finish up on in this podcast really briefly, and I won't go into it in too much depth and detail, just because it could literally be a whole nother podcast in and of itself where I talk for 60 minutes about it. But just kind of recovery more broadly. And the reason I wanted to end the podcast on this is because sometimes, especially what I've noticed working with athletes over the past 7 or 8 years, and even myself at various points throughout my own athletic journey, some athletes have a tendency to get caught up in the weeds, so to speak, when it comes to certain aspects of training or even recovery. And what I mean by that is certain athletes, and I think especially like a lot of endurance athletes who tend to be very like type A, very, like hyper fixated and regimented on what they're doing and trying to figure out ways of doing little things better and better and better. Sometimes that can lead athletes astray from the bigger picture of the things that really matter the most and have the most impact on training, adaptation, and recovery. And with this newer market that's developed surrounding recovery, a lot of athletes tend to get hyper-focused on recovering, quote-unquote, better with all these different pieces of expensive technology and all these different modalities, when in reality what the evidence suggests is that sleep and nutrition are by far the two biggest aspects that contribute to adequate recovery. And recovery has different domains, like there's different aspects and different domains of recovery that we can talk about if we want to really start getting into the semantics of, well, what does recovery mean? What does it actually mean to recover between sessions? And it can depend a lot depending on the athlete and what time of year they're in, whether they're just in a heavy training cycle or if they're in more a racing cycle where they have frequent races. Recovery can look a little bit different. But in general, what I mean by recovery here is just the quote-unquote return to baseline. That's kind of it's not the best way of putting it. There's been other researchers and experts on this topic who have probably defined it a little bit better. But basically the way that I review general recovery on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis is undergoing stressful training and being able to tolerate it and adapt from that training so that you can get back to a homeostatic state. That's not always the case. You don't always want to be in a state of homeostasis, but in general, over time, good recovery looks like essentially being able to tolerate and adapt to the stresses that are being placed upon the body. Typically, if you're not responding well and you're kind of doing too much and not doing enough of the right things to recover, that's when risk of like injury, illness, things like that starts to crop up and get higher and higher. And so from a global recovery standpoint, sleep and nutrition are by far like 99.9% of good recovery. And sleep, it's pretty simple, just getting at least 7 to 8 hours of good quality sleep each night. research tends to show pretty clearly that as soon as athletes start getting below 6-7 hours of sleep a night, there's a much greater increase in their risk of experiencing injuries. And then nutrition is the same thing too. There's lots of different components and aspects to nutrition. Nutrition is such a broad topic. But in general, what I mean by nutrition is consuming enough calories, getting enough of the macronutrients in, which is carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, getting enough micronutrients in to support your needs as an athlete, so vitamins and minerals, and consuming enough fluids throughout the day so that you're staying adequately hydrated. If you're staying on top of those major components of nutrition and you're sleeping well, then that's really 99.9% of your recovery. All these other things that athletes are looking to do to improve their recovery are at best going to have a very, very small marginal improvement or enhancement on their body's ability to recover. So it's really making sure that as an athlete, you're dialing in your sleep and your nutrition as best you can. And then if you feel like you want to start to dive into some other modalities to help support recovery in certain ways, then yeah, that's where I think looking into certain devices and tools and pieces of technology can sometimes be useful. And so for the case of recovery boots, let's say your sleep and your nutrition is pretty dialed in, but you tend to be someone who's pretty go, and you always feel the need to be like on your feet and doing something, then compression boots might be a worthwhile investment for you. If they do get you and if they do force you to kind of sit down, relax, and just not do anything for an hour, watch some TV, read a book, maybe you fall asleep, take a nap, and you still feel like you're doing something because you're wearing the boots, they're actually doing something to you. So it kind of satisfied that need of maybe the type A driven athlete where they really want to feel like they're doing something. But then also at the same time, they're relaxing, they're laying down, they're not physically doing anything. They're giving their body some time and some space to relax, recover, and get some rest. And so, yeah, from the standpoint of compression boots, they could be useful for that type of athlete. But only if the athlete is focusing on sleep and nutrition and they have those dialed in to a pretty good spot. Really, all these other recovery modalities, even if you did every single recovery modality out there, bought every single piece of equipment, piece of technology that's known to mankind that has some type of potential effect on recovery, nothing will ever outdo poor sleep and poor nutrition. So the focus should really be on good training practices first so you can get the stimulus, and then making sure you're recovering from training well, which is primarily sleep and nutrition. And then it might be something to consider for you as an athlete or a coach if you're working with an athlete, maybe looking at some of these additional modalities that might offer some small additional benefit. So hopefully you found this podcast episode useful as it relates to the discussion of compression boots surrounding recovery and endurance athletes. If you have any questions on this topic, I will, like I mentioned, link into the show notes the write-up that I did on this topic so you can read about some of the research that's been done in a little bit more detail. And as always, I'll be sure to link into the show notes all of the references that I used in the making of this podcast episode, so that if you feel like you want to dive into the research literature a little bit more, then you'll have those references to go to. And if you still have questions on this topic, you can always reach me via email or other contact methods like my social media, and I'll be sure to link those modes of contact into the show notes below. Other than that, I hope you continue tuning into future episodes, but in the meantime, happy training and happy recovery. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. The support is greatly appreciated. If you want to support the show a little bit more, I have set up a Patreon link, and I've included that Patreon link in the show notes. So if you feel like giving us a little bit of extra support, feel free to do so through Patreon. Also, feel free to give us a review or a star rating, depending on which platform you are listening on. Those reviews and the feedback is greatly appreciated. And then finally, if you know of someone who would be interested in our podcast show, feel free to share this episode or just the podcast in general with them, and that is greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for tuning in to today's episode, and thank you for supporting the show.